Hey everyone, this is Miss Stewart. Welcome to your notes on 1.1, which is about ecosystems. So before we get started, we're going to cover some of the objectives and skills that you'll get from these. And the main learning objective is to be able to explain how the availability of resources influences species interactions. Some of the knowledge that we're going to cover in these notes is learning about predator-prey relationships, symbiosis, which is two different species in an ecosystem. And then we'll learn about competition and resource partitioning. Now, by the end of this, the skill that you're going to get a chance to practice is describing an environmental concepts and processes. So before we dive into ecosystems, we should start with some of the ecosystem basics. So these go kind of from smallest up to largest. And so if you look at the first part here, at the smallest level, we're going to have an individual. And this is just going to be one single organism. Remember that an organism is a living thing. So the example here would be an elk. Now, if we move up to the next step, we have a population. And this is a group of individuals of the same species. So this would be the elk herd, because they're all elk. Then the next one is going to be a community, which is all living organisms in an area. So this would include the moose, the rabbit, the owl, the elk, the trees, the grass, all the things that are living in this area. Then we step up to an ecosystem. Now this is all the living and non-living things. So it includes some of those plant and animals I just mentioned, but we also start including rocks, soil, water, air, the non-living things as well is an ecosystem. Now the next step up is a biome. And the reason that this has this star right here is because it's an important part. And biomes are something that you're going to learn more in depth with notes 1.2 and 1.3. So more on that to come. But a biome is a large area with similar climate conditions that determine plant and animal species there. So an example would be a tropical rainforest. So because of the type of conditions in tropical rainforest, that's going to determine the types of plants and animals that can live there. And you're going to see similar conditions in rainforests that are in different places on the planet. So maybe a tropical rainforest in Hawaii versus in another part, you're going to have similar characteristics of those conditions there. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is organism interactions. And this chart here is kind of a good visual for looking at some of the summaries of how these go. So negative means it negatively impacts both species. Positive would be a positive there. 0 means it's not positive or negative. So as we go through these, we'll first look at competition. And this is where organisms are fighting over a resource. It could be food, it could be shelter, it could be water. And this ultimately limits the population size of both of the species. So that's why here it is negative for both, because it limits their population size. Competition doesn't help them. The next one is going to be predation, which is where one organism is going to be getting energy from another one. And so as you see here, it's got a positive, it benefits one of them. And it's not so positive when you get eaten. So that's why it's going to be a negative for the other species. Then the next one that we have here is going to be, sorry about that. The next one that we're going to have here is going to be mutualism. And this is a relationship that benefits both organisms. Coral would be an example of this. So you get a positive for both. And then we have commensalism. And this is going to be a relationship that benefits one organism, but doesn't really have any positive or negative impact on the other species. So this might be how, like, a bird nests in a tree. The bird gets the shelter. The tree, it's not hurting it. It's not benefiting it. It's just kind of enough in there. So the first one we're going to look a little bit more in depth on is predation, because there are different types of predation. One of these would be herbivores, which are plant eaters. And this is going to be where the species eats the plant for energy. An example would be a giraffe eating a tree. Now, the next type is going to be true predators, like carnivores. These ones kill and they eat prey for energy. So an example would be a leopard, then going and eating that giraffe. The leopard is the true predator. It is the carnivore. It ate that giraffe. Then the next type is going to be parasites. And these ones use a host organism for energy, but usually they don't kill them. They just kind of live inside of them. They steal resources, or they come by and steal resources and then they leave. But it is a type of predation. It just usually isn't going to result in death. So an example of this could be mosquitoes, where we get our blood sucked by them, or a sea lamprey, which this is a sea lamprey. It's a type of fish that will bite on and will suck blood out of the fish that it's biting on. And then the next one is going to be a parasitoid. And these ones lay eggs inside of a host organism. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae eat the hosts for energy. So an example of this would be a parasitic wasp, which you can see it laying its eggs there in that caterpillar. Another example would be a botfly. If you want to be super grossed out, you can Google botflies and see what they do. But I feel like you kind of get a general idea from the description, but that is a type of predation that they do. Now, the next way that we can have interactions with organisms is going to be through symbiosis. Now, if you break down the Latin parts, it can help you kind of remember what symbiosis stands for. So sym means together, bio is living, and osis is a condition. So it's going to be any close and long-living interaction between two organisms of different species. That's the important part here, is that they are different species. The same species is not symbiosis. Now we have a few different types of these. We have mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. All of these are considered symbiotic relationships. So mutualism, this is going to be where organisms of different species live together closely in a way that benefits both of them. So both of them would have that little positive. And an example of this is coral, which, if you did not know this, fun fact, coral is actually an animal in a symbiotic relationship with algae. So this image kind of sees, if you zoom in really close, you've got the animal right here, but actually within some of the cells, you have algae here. And this is beneficial for both the coral and the algae, because the coral, through cellular respiration, gives off CO2, which algae takes in, and then it creates sugars through the process of photosynthesis. And those sugars are going to then provide energy for the coral, because the coral can eat it. So they kind of have this awesome relationship where they are both getting a benefit out of this. Another example would be lichen. And this is going to be fungi living in a symbiotic relationship with algae. Again, the algae provides sugar, which is food, for the fungi, and the fungi then provides nutrients for the algae there. And this is an image of lichen. You may have seen this growing on trees or on rocks, but this is what lichen does, or what it looks like. Next up, we have good old competition. And the important thing to remember about competition is that it reduces population sizes, because there are fewer resources available and fewer organisms can survive. So that's kind of the star point about competition. Remember that competition reduces population size. So if there's ever a competition environment, you're going to have both populations are going to decrease because there are less resources for them to have. Now, with competition, there's actually something called resource partitioning, and this is where different species use the same resource in different ways, and this decreases competition, which is ultimately good for both species. So resource partitioning is going to be a great benefit for both of them, because they've kind of found their own specific little niche in how they can have less competition with other organisms there. So we've got a few examples of this. Sorry, guys, still figuring out this system. So with this example, if we first look at something called temporal partitioning, this is where you use resources at different times. And so you have, for example, wolves and coyotes hunting at different times. So coyotes hunt at night, wolves hunt during the day. It reduces competition because they're hunting at different times. So they aren't competing for the exact same thing at the exact same time. Another example is spatial partitioning. So spatial partitioning is where you use different areas of a shared habitat. Now, one example of this would be different length of roots. They're both still trying to get water and soil nutrients, but this grass is going to have shallow roots, and then this bush is going to have roots that go farther down. So they're still competing for some of the same things, but they're getting it at different levels in the soil, and so there's less competition. It's not like they're all competing right here on this top layer of soil. Another example of this can be with different types of warblers, where they live in different sections of the tree. So if you look at the yellow shaded, that's where each species lives. So they each can kind of have their own part of the tree, and they aren't competing for the exact same space there. And another one is morphological partitioning. And this is where, through evolution, you have come to have actual differences in the body features that have evolved. And so they use different resources based on these different body features. So for example, if you look at the black-footed ferret versus an ermine, you are going to have longer fangs here, shorter fangs, you've got a bigger head, you've got a smaller head. So they're going to actually probably end up eating different prey, or they might have, like this one might eat bigger fish and this one eats smaller fish. So because they have actual morphological differences in their bodies, they're going to have less competition with each other. So this brings us to our practice FRQ 1.1, which is where you're going to be practicing this skill of describing environmental concepts and processes. So what I want you to do is take a look at this food web here. And I want you to identify two organisms that compete for a shared food resource and describe how resource partitioning could reduce the competition between the two organisms that you identified. And remember, the bolded words are in reference to our FRQ verbs, so make sure that you reference what those mean.